It's the first criminal prosecution of a child of a sitting US president. In the last few hours, President Joe Biden's son Hunter has been found guilty on all 3 counts in his gun crime trial. The jury found that Hunter Biden had lied about his drug use on a federal government form while buying a weapon in 2018. Mr. Biden's defence team had argued that he was in recovery from addiction when he bought the weapon. We'll get the latest reaction from the courtroom in a moment. Now, in the last hour, President Biden's been speaking at a gun control conference in Washington, D.C., which brings together survivors of gun violence, volunteers, as well as advocates. Earlier, Joe Biden issued this statement. He said, "I am the president, but I'm also a dad. Jill and I love our son, and we're so proud of the man he is today." So many families who've had loved ones battle addiction understand the feeling of pride seeing someone you love come out the other side and be so strong and resilient in recovery. As I also said last week, I will accept the outcome of this case and will continue to respect the judicial process as Hunter considers an appeal. Well, let's have a listen now to the prosecution. Here's Special Counsel David Vise.
While there has been much testimony about the defendant's abuse of drugs and alcohol, ultimately this case was not just about addiction, a disease that haunts families across the United States, including Hunter Biden's family. This case was about the illegal choices defendant made while in the throes of addiction, his choice to lie on a government form when he bought a gun, and the choice to then possess that gun. It was these choices and the combination of guns and drugs that made his conduct dangerous. Second, no one in this country is above the law.
Well, my colleague Carl Nasman is at the court in Delaware for us. So, Carl, just bring us up to date with the events of the day.
It's really been quite the whirlwind of a day. We all arrived here at 9 a.m. That's when the court opened, and that's when the jury was set to begin its deliberations for the day. By 11 a.m., just 2 hours later, that jury was once again re-emerging, coming back into the courtroom, and they had reached that verdict. People in the courtroom listened as they read out a guilty verdict on all 3 of these felony charges. Hunter Biden, of course, he was in the room. He was listening, fairly stoic, his reaction. And afterwards, once the jury left the room, he thanked his defense team. He hugged his lawyers, and then he hugged his wife, Melissa. As they headed out of the courtroom, they were joined by Jill Biden, the First Lady of the U.S., and off they went. And it was really, I think, a bit surprising for many people how quickly the jury reached its verdict. Just 3 hours in total of deliberations, 1 hour on Monday, 2 hours today. Clearly, they were convinced by what was a mountain of evidence presented by the prosecution, reaching a verdict, and it was a historic one. The first time that the child of a sitting president has been convicted of a crime in a federal court.
OK, Carl Nasman, thank you very much for bringing us up to date on the very latest from the courtroom. Well, Richard Painter is the former chief White House ethics lawyer in the George W. Bush administration, now law professor at the University of Minnesota. Welcome to The Context, Mr. Painter. Looking at the charges, what are the possible penalties that Hunter Biden could face when it comes to sentencing?
Well, this is probably a case that will end in probation. We have yet to see what the judge will do. This is a serious crime. This is a felony to lie on a form to obtain a gun. The broader problem we have in the United States is that gun laws such as this one are rarely enforced. We have these laws on the books, but prosecutors are very reluctant to prosecute people for lying about drug use, alcohol use, domestic violence, and other material information when they purchase a gun. The National Rifle Association, the gun lobby, has an enormous amount of influence in the United States. So our laws are inadequate with respect to gun safety, and the laws we have are rarely enforced. And that's why, of course, Hunter Biden and his attorneys are claiming that this is somehow a special prosecution targeted at him. I have absolutely no sympathy for Hunter Biden. I have absolutely no sympathy for anyone who lies on a form to obtain a gun permit in the United States. But we absolutely need to enforce our gun laws and not just have this be a one-off case brought against Hunter Biden. And the irony is that a lot of the people in the National Rifle Association and those who don't want to enforce any of these gun laws, they are backing Donald Trump for president, and he is a convicted felon in New York for falsification of business records, also a very serious crime. And I remind everyone that Hunter Biden is not running for president of the United States. His father is.
Indeed.
And that's really what this story is all about.
It is, but of course, one of the questions which is more straying into the politics, I might say, is how this might impact his father's chances. We'll come to that perhaps in a second, but I wanted to first of all ask you about what his path is to a possible appeal. We heard from President Biden alluding to a possibility of an appeal.
Well, he can appeal just as Donald Trump can appeal the criminal conviction he has in New York. I think that in both cases, the appeals are unlikely to succeed, but there's always grounds to try to appeal a criminal conviction, and Hunter Biden has every right to do that. The broader issue in the political sphere ought to be, are we serious about enforcing gun laws in the United States? Or are we just going to be prosecuting Hunter Biden, not other people who lie on these forms or people who buy guns for others who are ineligible? We have an epidemic of gun violence in the United States. We need to have law and order in this country, and enforcing our gun laws for everybody is absolutely critical. And second, we need to remember that Hunter Biden is not a candidate for president. His father is, and a lot of families have had problems with drug addiction, problems with criminal conduct, but those are not the family members who should be running for president of the United States. We should not have anyone who's a convicted felon running for any political party for the presidency of our country.
OK, thank you very much, Richard Painter, for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.
Now it's time to bring in our panel. Reminder of who they are: Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today, and Joe Walsh, former Republican presidential candidate. Richard there alluded to the politics around this, reminding us, of course, that he's not a candidate. Hunter Biden's not running for office. But Susan, how much is this going to play into the election campaign?
Well, I think it's never a good thing when your son is convicted on felony charges, especially involving guns, which is an issue that's very important to Democratic voters, as well as many Americans generally. On the other hand, the politics of this is a little complicated because on the one hand, Democrats are saying since this verdict that it demonstrates that Joe Biden, the president, is not manipulating the Justice Department is not weaponizing against his enemies. He didn't even intervene to save his son. This is the question of weaponization is one that Donald Trump has made in his trial. Republicans, on the other hand, are pointing to this as a sign, a kind of a equivalency that, Donald Trump is a convicted felon. Well, so is Hunter Biden. So I'm inclined to think that this might have some small impact, but I think that big issues facing this country now means that this is probably not going to be anything that's close to decisive.
What do you reckon, Joe? Is this going to be a Republican talking point as the months get closer to the presidential election?
Oh, absolutely, because it will be a talking point for Donald Trump, and every Republican echoes Donald Trump. I agree with everything Susan said, but here's the important point. Personally, I'm sure this is difficult for Joe Biden. It is a serious crime, and Hunter's going to pay a price. But politically, what did Joe Biden say today? He came out and he uttered words that Donald Trump is humanly incapable of uttering. I will accept the verdict, and I will continue to respect the judicial process, the justice process. That's the antithesis of what Donald Trump says and how Donald Trump has engaged in his one-man attack, but now the whole party, the Republican Party, continues to attack our justice system. Kudos to Joe Biden.
OK. One of the things I was struck by was that a juror has actually already spoken to the media. Susan, how common is this? I mean, I've seen in a few occasions when I lived in the US and worked out there that occasionally jurors would actually speak out after a trial. And one has spoken to an American outlet maintaining that no politics came into play when it was came to their deliberations. Politics was not even spoken about. But when the juror was asked whether Hunter should go to jail, he replied no. What do you make of all that, Susan?
Yeah. Well, jurors are, as a general matter, free to speak to the press after trials. Often they don't. Sometimes they speak to prosecutors and defense lawyers too for insights into how the jurors viewed different things. So that's not a huge surprise. The juror just chose not to release his name. That's probably a good idea given the heatedness of our politics here these days. You know, I think there are a lot of people who think the prosecution made their case. He lied when Hunter Biden lied when he signed the form and said he wasn't using drugs. There seemed to be a lot of evidence from members of his family that he was using drugs during that time, although he's now in recovery. But this is not a crime that traditionally leads to jail time, especially for a first offender and a gun that was not used in a violent crime. So if he gets sentenced to jail, that would be a surprise and at odds with how these defendants are traditionally treated.
Joe, what's your take on all of that?
I agree with Susan. I'd be really surprised if he were sentenced to jail. Again, though, watch the Republicans and watch Trump. Their entire theme this year has been that the justice system is being weaponized to go after Donald Trump. This clearly blunts that.
OK, just quickly, actually, Joe, because you used to be a talk show host. What are the kind of headlines that they're reporting on today then? What are the talk show hosts saying on this subject then?
Well, it's so fascinating because the right wing actually, where I come from, right wing media in America is like presenting this as some conspiracy, like this was a minor offense. And the only reason the Justice Department went after Biden on this and convicted him on this is to hide the greater financial crimes that Hunter Biden, along with his dad, committed, which there's zero proof of. So that's really the talking point on the right today, that this is a distraction from the more serious crimes that Hunter and his dad committed.